So if I'm a secretary and I see the possibility of making that kind of money, there is no loyalty to my boss that will prevent from doing that. And actually, when I had this intuition, I wrote an article first in Italy. There was an article in the Washington Post on this. And I said, we should pay whistleblower. And then I learned that actually, this is an old practice in the United States that was invented nothing short by Lincoln during the Civil War.
Now that the discussion is going on, I can see that go read history. There's so many good ideas hidden there.
This is a thing that doesn't make me very popular, but I am a big supporter of short sellers. And why? Because, again, if you start thinking about what are the news that find it more difficult to emerge, are the bad news. They know that this is incredibly unequal in terms of burden, so that if you tax CO2, you end up penalizing a lot people who drive cars. I'm here in India, and that burn a lot of CO2 to come here. Now, what I discover is kerosene for airplanes is tax-free. Why? Oh, there is a convention, blah, blah, but nobody talks about this.
Hello everyone, welcome to Arth Niti. I'm Shekhar Tomar. We are extremely delighted to have Professor Luigi Zingales with us today. He's currently a professor at the University of Chicago, Booth School of Business. His research work has significantly changed how we think about corporate finance, political economy, and institutions, and how they impact businesses. Apart from being a prolific researcher, Professor Zingales is also a very prolific public speaker on issues related to free market. He's also the co-author of the best-selling book, Saving Capitalism from the Capitalists, where he provides a very good defense of free markets, but what is needed to ensure that markets remain free. We are very happy to have you, Luigi. Thank you for your time and welcome to Arth Niti.
My pleasure.
So you have been working on corporate finance and other topics as well for a very long period of time. So maybe you can give me a sense, what do you actually study under corporate finance? Why is it important?
So I think that in the last 150 years, most of the economic activity has been moved into the corporate sector. And so corporate finance to me is really the study of modern capitalism, because modern capital is run by corporations, so understanding the way they are governed and the way they finance themselves, which is also the way they sort of share the pie that they produce, is at the core of what works and what doesn't work in capitalism today.
So it's both finance as well as governance. So if I just go on the first part, which is the finance part, what do you study there?
At least at the beginning of my career, I was trying to understand the differences in financing across countries and the importance of financial constraint into development and growth. That was kind of my initial interest.
And if you have to really go back and trace the history, have our understanding changed? Like if you go back 50 years ago, what's the part that has really changed about our understanding about how it works?
So I think that the literature went through phases, and I think that there was the major revolution brought by Modigliani and Miller, which was a very important contribution in understanding what matters and what doesn't in financing of firms. And for a little while, much of the literature was dominated by the idea that Modigliani and Miller was a representation of the real world, rather than understanding that was a way in which you see what frictions are important in the real world. And I think that now nobody challenges that anymore. I think that at least nobody that I know. So I think that everybody understands how to interpret the theorem as a way to stimulate research in the direction of the frictions that are important versus some of the preconceptions that before were important but have been dismissed by the theorem.
So for the non-finance people, what's this theorem actually?
So the theorem is that under certain assumptions, the way you finance your firm doesn't matter, which is very counterintuitive to most human beings, because of course, the way you finance your firms matters. What is important of the theorem is that people thought that the difference was because there is a different cost of capital in different instruments driven by the different level of risk that these instruments were bearing. And what Modigliani and Miller says is as long as your investment decision and your sort of corporate decision don't change, the way you finance really shouldn't matter, and the cost of your capital shouldn't matter, is only when there are some important effect on your cash flow that these finances matter. So, of course, taxes are very important, but also agency problems and information asymmetry, all these things that in the real world makes financing relevant. But those were kind of ignored at the beginning, and people were focusing on the fact that if you raise some equity, the cost of equity is larger than the cost of debt, and so they're assuming that equity was expensive, and some people still say that in the banking world, but Modigliani and Miller said no, the risk consideration is not what matters. Something else must be important if you want to say that the way you are financed is relevant.
But even now, if we go to the practical side of things, it's pretty much at a much later stage of life within the firm that you issue stocks or issue equity. Mm-hmm. Initially, it's still debt-funded or self-funded in some sense.
Yes, of course, in a sense, if you don't have access to capital markets in issuing your equity, I think that's a restriction, it's a cost, it's a friction. But again, what is this driven for? Is driven by the fact that you're not able to provide information about your company in a reliable way because the company is too small, or because you can't commit not to make the cash flow disappear in some form or another. So those are the frictions that are important, and that's where the research has gone in this direction.
And the other part of it, which you mentioned about corporate governance, what's the first order questions over there?
I think there are a lot of first order questions. It's just why who is in control matters, and in part is because who is in control might abscond some money. I had a long literature on private benefits of control and why those are important, particularly in countries where enforcement is not very strong. And more recently, my interest is focusing on externalities, to what extent who is in control might change the amount of externalities that produce. And the externalities could be the pollution you produce around you, could be the CO2 emission, could be also some risk that you spread in the system and are not properly controlled. So think about today, there is a huge issue about AI and the way research in AI is conducted. And if you think about the latest tension on OpenAI, was a tension about who was controlling the future of innovation and whose interests were taken into consideration. And I think OpenAI was structured as a non-for-profit precisely to prevent that the desire for profits might create some machines that are going to kill the world. And after the latest turmoil at the top, it seems that they're going for profit maximization all along. And so I think the world has become less secure as a result of that.
So let me ask on that, just to give the background context as well. So OpenAI, it's a weird structure. Even I don't understand it properly. So they have a non-profit board controlling
let's give them the background. OpenAI actually was created by a bunch of people, but mostly led by Elon Musk, who was very concerned about how AI could be used in a way that it might generate a damage for humankind. So the concern is, I create a machine that is so intelligent that might behave in a way that is against the interest of the very people who created that. It's called super alignment as a problem, but it's a standard corporate governance problem. So corporations are, in a sense, superhuman because they are able to achieve goals that are past the goals of each individual member. To what extent these institutions are acting in the interest of the people that created them or not. And OpenAI, I think that has the risk of acting in the interest, against the interest of the people who created, against the interest of humanity at large. So OpenAI was created as a non-for-profit precisely to avoid that risk. And then when Elon Musk basically left the company, there wasn't enough financing, and so they tried to raise money from Microsoft, and in order to compensate Microsoft for that money, they create a for-profit arm that is underneath the non-for-profit institution, and they cap the level of profits that Microsoft can make out of that. With the tension, my understanding of the reason why Sam Altman was fired was because Sam Altman was trying to get rid of a board member who had written a paper saying that OpenAI was going too fast and was creating too much risk. And so Altman manipulated the board trying to get rid of Ellen Toner, was this board member. And when Ellen Toner found out, actually got the board together and they fired Sam Altman. And Sam Altman reacted by taking the company with him, basically most of the employees. So at which point they left no choice but the losing side sort of resigned from the board. But they appointed a bunch of board members who are clearly very much aligned with let the AI whip and go as fast as possible in order to maximize profits. And so the risk for humankind is bigger. It's a bit like we had the people developing the nuclear bomb and the discovery of nuclear power being motivated by profit maximization. And I think that the world would be kind of a bit more risky today.
But if we zoom out a little bit, probably you have provided like one of the best defenses for free markets. You don't think that in such a situation like the current progress of AI, there is some way that free markets can solve this problem to some extent? Or you need some external regulation?
I think that actually this is a very interesting question because to me, free market means free enterprise and a different form of organization to deal with issues. And both OpenAI and the competitor Anthropic are experimenting with different form of organization, this non-for-profit at all, because they realize that there are risks involved. So this is not a form of government regulation, it's a form of, if you want, of self-regulation. But these organizations are not necessarily working very well. That's what they're learning on OpenAI. And so there are some interesting tension. And if you think that the market is completely competitive, then regulation would play no role. But the market, in my view, is not competitive because the cost of training this model is enormously high. And this is Microsoft invested more than $12 billion in the process. So you can't expect anybody to be able to compete with OpenAI tomorrow. So there is a huge amount of discretion of the board. And so understanding the way they are financed, understanding the way they allocate property rights is extremely important for the future of innovation and the future of humankind.
But maybe it's not possible for any random startup to raise that much money. But if the stakes are so high, then we should expect at least the top 100 firms in the world would try to go in this direction.
I think that if you are saying that Amazon, Google, and Microsoft will do, yes, but we're talking about 4 or 5 organizations. And those organizations can very easily collude on some issue, even tacitly collude, which is not a crime if you tacitly collude. Now, how tacit is tacit, I leave for others to decide. But you can't expect sort of competition and the standard rule of competition to work in this game.
And so this also ties into a lot of your research that you have done on the firm growth side. And so I'm just setting up the stage here to understand. So in the 19th, early 20th century, we had these big companies as well, and you talk about vertical integration. There is this Standard Oil, and then both on the demand where they're buying the oil and the selling, which is the pumps, they had vertically integrated supply chains. So is it something similar or very different now that you have to be a big firm, you have to be this vertically integrated structure, or that's not the case anymore?
So I think that the world has gone through cycles, which are mostly driven by technology. So we know that what goes under the name of the Second Industrial Revolution that took place in the United States in the end of the 19th century, I think economies of scale became very, very important. And so we saw the emergence of the large integrated firms. And as technology made scale less important, for example, thanks to the diffusion of electric power rather than the large combustion plant, etc., I think that there was an ability of more firms to compete. And as the markets became bigger, a lot of the steps that were integrated in these vertical firms became available in the marketplace, was so much easier to enter. So one of the reasons why Tesla was able to enter into the car market is because today you can buy a lot of the components in the open market. They're not all produced internally by GM. However, with the rise of the digital economy, we now see an enormous economies of scope driven by the possession of data. And so I think that this is something that needs to be addressed, in my view, at the antitrust level, because
understand, like, what would be the key differentiating factor? So now it's not vertically integrated, but they have other...
No, I think that the key factor now is the control of data. And particular in the United States, data are owned by firms and not by customers. And they can be used by firms in every possible form or shape. This is not true in the European Union, where the GDPR requires you to go back to customers and ask customers if they approve the use of data for other purposes. And so the economies of scopes are severely limited in the European Union, but not in the United States, where I can collect data, for example, with Google Maps, and then use this data to predict consumer behavior or decide how to finance firms, or even use it in real estate, because I can see what are the sectors that are trending in real estate, and so invest in real estate. And so really the concentration of information in one or two sources give those companies an enormous amount of power that they are massively using to capture all the rent. And this is at the conference we're just here. We heard that Google is partnering with banks to do the lending, but charge a fee. So basically appropriates all the rents through fees, so they don't actually need to do physical lending in order to extract all the rents in the lending sector. So you're going to have a lot of activities that operates a little bit like Uber drivers. And it says Uber drivers are independent contractor, but all the rents are captured at the centralized level by Uber. And in the same way, we're going to have the Uberization of the economy, in which you have a lot of sectors that operate on the reservation value, put on the reservation value by platforms that capture all the rents.
And so I was reading one of your papers on this exact idea, and I guess one defense for these companies or these platforms is that They are incredibly powerful network economies. So if there's not one big platform, then the efficiency goes down. And probably, for example, in Uber, if it doesn't have a big market on both sides, lots of customers and lots of drivers, then you don't have this benefit. And I mean, maybe I was living under the rock, but the idea that you mentioned in the paper was interoperability. And this also ties back to some of the discussion that happened 100 years ago. Yeah. So maybe you can tell us how that would work, an alternate system.
I think that we live under an impression, the reason why you thought you were living under a rock, I think you are living under the spell of the existing big tech that say that's the only possible world. And the reality is not true. It says network externalities are a real thing, but they're not a new thing, because think about the phone. The phone is useless if I'm not able to have my friends and people I want to call on the same phone network. So if there is a business with network externalities, that's the phone, okay? Why today we have, think about cell phones, a lot of operators, and particularly India is one of the most competitive markets because you have a lot of phone operators. How they work is because there is a interoperability mandate, and you are forced to basically allow somebody that calls from, I don't know the operator in India, but I think that the Tata phone line, I'm sure Tata is a phone line, and Adani is the other one. If you call from one to the other, you are forced to get the connection, okay? So this forced interoperability makes the market all of a sudden competitive, okay? Why the social network are not competitive is because Facebook, for example, has fought very aggressively to preempt people to make interoperable. So there was early on a little startup that was facilitating access of consumers to social media. So if I wanted to post contemporaneously on Facebook and Twitter, this company called Power Venture was actually helping do that. And in order to do that, of course, I had to access both Facebook and Twitter at the same time. Facebook stopped that by making Facebook non-accessible in this way, and making basically social media not interoperable among themselves. And that created the power of Facebook. The same is true for Uber. This is having a platform where the operators and the consumers meet is a fantastic idea, but you want this platform to be open. So if you are an independent contractor, you don't have to go through Uber. You can be another company that puts the services there, and the same as consumers. If you have that system, you have a true competitive market. Otherwise, you have a oligopoly or monopoly in the hands of a few people.
But I mean, what you're saying makes total sense. And it's not that we haven't seen this happen in certain markets. But how far do you think are we from this kind of regulation, at least in some market? I know Europe takes a lead on some of these issues.
Actually, not because I'm in India, because I said this many times around the world. I think India is at the forefront of this, for example, in the financial sector. So I think in order to have a truly competitive market, you need to have a infrastructure that somewhat is provided with a partnership between the private sector and the public sector. I think this goes back in terms of inspiration to the book that Raghu and I wrote 20 years ago, that in order to have a truly capitalist system, we need to have an infrastructure to support it. And the capitalists themselves have no interest in supporting this infrastructure. You need to have some democratic process to support that infrastructure. And I think that the other system, the UPI, the stack system that India created, is this infrastructure. With this common infrastructure, you can have a very competitive market system. But if this infrastructure is privately provided, then you tend pretty quickly to a monopoly. And I think in the United States, we're going straight in that direction. And I think India has created the infrastructure to avoid that. So in my view, is at the forefront in this battle.
But I mean, maybe there's some innovation rules still for these firms. So if you know already, I mean, now these platforms are common and we can have it across the sectors, different kind of industries. We can have similar matching platforms, let's say. But Uber, when it came with it for the first time, it was really an innovation in some sense. So why would private firms innovate into it? So what I'm talking about here is like, in India, we have seen it happen in the US, and we tried to avoid the problem. And so maybe public institutions can invest, build this infrastructure. But at least somewhere in the world, you would still need private firms to think about these issues.
I'm not saying that they shouldn't. I'm just trying to say that eventually, when they become a monopoly, you need to force some interoperability. I think that the only way we got competition in the cellular phone market is by forcing interoperability. And I think we should do it in a lot of sectors, because the risk is to concentrate among an enormous amount of power and an enormous amount of rents in the hands of very few people.
So I think in India we solved this problem in the sense because we had the benefit of looking what is happening.
No, I see what you're saying. I think that is a very good point. But first of all, I don't understand why Europe, that had the same benefit, is not taking advantage of what India is doing.
No. So, but what I'm trying to see is like, do you see regulation moving in this direction in other economies?
That in India, yes. In the United States, no, because the organizations that succeeded in having this market power, they also have an enormous political power, so they don't want that regulation to take place. Why in the United States we pay an enormous amount of fees for Visa and MasterCard when you can do the same thing at a fraction of the cost as China and India have shown us? And the answer is because Visa and MasterCard are very powerful. That's the only reason. And why Europe was forced to reduce that cost by regulation is because Visa and MasterCard are less powerful in Europe. End of story.
I think there's also a redivision of rent from poorer credit card customers to richer, in some sense.
Which is an extra reason to create regulation, to create competition, because it's true, and it's something that I actually feel bad every time I use my credit card and I get miles. I am basically screwing some poor person who's paying cash. And I feel bad about that.
Going back to the corporate governance side, I see that some of your work in the last decade or so has also been looking at corporate frauds. And you have like a lot of discussion on who becomes a whistleblower. So who becomes a whistleblower?
So I think that the interest there is, number one, to understand how pervasive corporate fraud is, because there are moments in which we see some scandals and they get attention and we think this is a big problem. Then on a day-to-day basis, we think that this is a secondary issue. And so one of the paper that I've been working for many years but has come out this year is trying to estimate how much corporate fraud there is around by using a natural experiment, because normally we only see the part of the iceberg that is above the water level, which is the fraud that is caught. And we don't get to see how much fraud is not caught, because by definition it's not caught, so we don't see it. So how do we get to peek under the surface? We make this very simplistic assumption, but it's not too far off reality, that immediately after the demise of Arthur Andersen, everybody was scared that there were a lot of frauds, and particularly if I was an audit firm and I was taking on my...
So this is which year we are talking about?
It's 2003.
2003.
You have a lot of audit firms that take over the business from Arthur Andersen that went bust. Then you're going to do an extra level of care in cleaning up the account and checking that there is nothing fraudulent immediately after you take on those businesses. So we assume that, and this assumption actually underestimates the level of fraud, but we assume that after the Arthur Andersen demise, all the former Arthur Andersen client got revealed all the fraud that they had as a result of this cleanup that the new auditors did. And using this, we find out that basically 2/3 of the frauds generally are not discovered. Okay? And then we apply this to the average level of fraud discovered, and we find out that the amount of fraud taking place in the United States is quite large among large companies. It represents like roughly 10% of the companies. And so that's a pretty big phenomenon. Okay? And then there is a question how companies get away with that. And the answer is, at this point, a conjecture. But my conjecture is many of them actually sell to other companies or they merge with other companies. And so they paper over the problem. And the new acquirer does not want to reveal when they realize that they bought a lemon. And so this is completely ignored. But I think is a major sort of phenomenon.
But did the firms which hired Arthur Andersen, they knew that they can do this shady business and they just get a draw of bad firms?
No. So I think that the assumption is, are Arthur Andersen firms similar on an ex-ante basis to the other firms?
To the other firms.
And that's a very good question. In fact, we were very hesitant in writing this paper because we thought, this is not a credible assumption. But then, two things. Number one, Arthur Andersen was indicted for fraud, but eventually was acquitted. By that time, the company was already gone, but the Supreme Court said that the indictment was improper. So I don't think Arthur Andersen was worse than any other audit firm. And in fact, all the literature in accounting says that Arthur Andersen will, except maybe in the Houston office where Enron was, Arthur Andersen was no better or worse than any other audit firm. So I think the assumption that firms were similar on an ex-ante basis is pretty realistic.
So you did it in a more forensic way, so it wouldn't make a thriller, but there are so many frauds which can be turned into great movies. Who, according to you, like you also have work on whistleblowers?
Yeah, so the question is, a good system is a system, a good capitalist system is where bad information is brought to light so that this fraud is stopped. And the threat of bringing bad information to light is what keeps things at bay. And actually, my interest got triggered by a large Italian firms in 2003, where Parmalat was discovered to be a major fraudulent firm. And when I read all the story and the accounts, I realized that a lot of employees knew about the fraud, but had no interest in bringing up to the surface. And I said, there is something deeply wrong here, because you have, Parmalat was listed both in Milan and in New York. So you had the Italian SEC, the American SEC, you had credit rating agency, you had banks, you had equity analysts. All this were trying to see whether there was a fraud or not. And all these agencies are very expensive, if you think about it. And the employees knew that information, but then that information never was transferred to this agency. And so that's a question of what are the friction in that revelation of information?
So just for my own sense, what was the fraud in this case? Sorry, I'm not aware.
Actually, they're multiple. That's what was wonderful of Parmalat. Majorly two, they overestimated their sales by a huge factor. In fact, they had, this is the funny story, they had, in order to settle the accounts, they had an account in Cuba where they were over-invoicing the sales in Cuba. And this is where the employees knew, because somebody did a division of how many liters of milk that were sold to Cuba and how many Cubans there are in Cuba. And if you divide the two, you can't reconcile how is it possible unless every Cuban was like the Roman Empress Agrippina that was taking bath in milk to have a better skin. I think that you couldn't understand how they could possibly consume all that milk. So that was the joke that was going around. The second is they falsify the existence of a 5 billion euro Cayman account. And they falsify not in a complicated derivative transaction. They falsify with paper and glue. So they took a letterhead of Bank of America, they cut the letterhead, they posted on a piece of paper saying, hereby we certify that we have, they pasted and they faxed it to the auditor, and the auditor took it as a verification. Okay?
Wow.
So my intuition is, I don't think that the CEO or the CFO was there cutting the letterhead and pasting letterhead with the glue. Also because I'm sure they wouldn't do a good job at doing that. So there was a secretary doing this job, okay? Now this secretary knew that something was wrong, okay? And why this person did not speak up? Because and no incentive to speak up. In fact, the secretary was probably overpaid as a secretary, not by much, but was overpaid for keeping silent, okay? Now, imagine we had a system that say that if you uncover a fraud, you get a fraction of the money that is recovered. So if you uncover a fraud of 5 billion euro, even if you have a 10% of that, sorry my French, is a shitload of money. Okay? So if I'm a secretary and I see the possibility of making that kind of money, there is no loyalty to my boss that would prevent from doing that. And actually, when I had this intuition, I wrote an article first in Italy, then in actually the American press. There was an article in the Washington Post on this. And I said, we should pay whistleblower. And then I learned that actually this is an old practice in the United States that was invented nothing short by Lincoln during the Civil War. Why? Because during the Civil War, the procurement, the uniform and the rifles of the Union Army were terrible because the suppliers were skimming on the supplies. And so Lincoln introduced a compensation for who was turning up evidence of fraud by the suppliers of the Union Army. So one of the reasons why the Union Army won the Civil War is thanks to this whistleblower reward system. And so I started to advocate whistleblower all over the place. And we wrote that paper, Who Blew the Whistle? And exactly my little claim to fame that when Dodd-Frank was discussed in Congress, that paper was brought as evidence that the whistleblower program works. And actually, there is now a provision in Dodd-Frank that protects the whistleblower, not to the extent that I wanted, but better than nothing, because the message from that paper is we should create a whistleblower program for corporate fraud. And what Dodd-Frank did was exactly that. So in the little thing, I contribute my little piece toward a good outcome.
So now that the discussion is going on, I can see that go read history. There's so many good ideas hidden there.
Absolutely, absolutely. There's nothing new under the sun, but it's important to adapt the good ideas to the new times. So I think that there are a lot of important details on how you organize this program. And I think this need to be adapted to the modern time. But I think that good ideas are far and few, but they need to be cultivated and adapted.
So this is on the internal side of whistleblowing idea. Can there be like some external factors as well? And I wanted your opinion on the Hindenburg report which came recently.
Tell me more about the...
It's the Adani company, and there was a report by these short-selling company in the US. Do you think that kind of a structure can also work, or it's really
this is a thing that doesn't make me very popular, but I am a big supporter of short sellers. And why? Because, again, if you start thinking about what are the news that find it more difficult to emerge, are the bad news. So paying the whistleblower is, to some extent, a cheaper version of the short sellers. Okay, the short sellers are paid to find out the bad information. Now, the system of whistleblower has more guarantee because you cannot easily manipulate the stock. I think that the short seller have a bad reputation because some short sellers trying to manipulate the stock and etc. But the good short sellers are the one who collects the evidence and then show the stock. Okay, that is a very useful exercise to expose corporate fraud. And one of the biggest fraud was Wirecard in Germany, and there were short sellers that kept saying that Wirecard was a fraud, and BaFin, the German regulator, instead of looking into the fraud, actually tried to attack the regulator. To attack the short seller. Eventually, was proven that it was a major fraud, so BaFin lost a lot of its credibility. And now I just read recently that it seems that one of the key people in Wirecard was also a Russian Secret Service agent. So I think that the short seller are better than the CIA in protecting us against foreign secret services.
And I guess the reputation is super important for the short sellers, because if you do this just for private gains, I mean, of course, they're doing it for private gains, but reputation is really at stake over here, because if you do it multiple times, you're just short selling for profit without good evidence, then you cannot stay in the market for long. So there is some kind of self-regulation there.
Yeah, I think there is more than self-regulation. There is survival of the fittest over the long term. However, being short seller is a very difficult business, especially in a world where stock prices on average go up. And then, so we see the number of short sellers actually shrinking, and that's a problem because I believe in whistleblowers and short seller more than I believe in regulators, because I see BaFin, in a sense, you will think that if there is something you can trust from the Germans is to have good regulators, but they fail miserably.
So I'm changing tracks now, but a lot of your work recently, and because you speak so much publicly and openly about these issues, one of the topics that you have been raising for a while is that economists are probably poking their nose everywhere, and it's probably becoming dangerous for policy making.
So I don't think it's a problem if economists come up with a suggested solution. I find it problematic when we try to substitute our judgment to the politician judgment. I think that economists are very good in analyzing trade-offs, but where you want to end up in that trade-off is very much a political decision. And the only consolation is economists are not the only one, because if you look at the epidemiologists, it seems that are worse than us. During the pandemic, epidemiologists were making public policy statements on the way we should behave. And there are trade-offs. There are trade-offs between how much we lose in training young kids versus how many old people we care. Okay, this is a very difficult trade-off. I don't feel competent to making that. That's the reason why we're politicians.
But you feel competent enough to question it.
Of course, to question it, absolutely. But I think at the end of the day, we should provide the best possible evidence to a politician, for a politician to make an informed decision. Unfortunately, many economists end up making evidence to induce politicians to choose a trade-off in one particular direction because they have an agenda. And that disqualifies, I think, our position as economists.
But in general, if there are humans, they would always have this kind of bias. So you can't charge just the economists with this kind of bias, I guess. If you have other people, even if you don't consult economists, they would also have a bias.
No, of course we all have bias, but I think that I would like to divide the role of understanding the cost of the various trade-off from the role of picking where you lay down, where you end up in that trade-off, okay? Those are two different professions, and, you know, economists can become politicians, but I think playing both roles is somewhat could be problematic in that direction, because you don't know am I speaking like an economist or am I speaking like a politician? And there are mechanisms that keep economists in check, which are our reputation as an economist, whether we can publish papers in peer review, etc. And there are mechanisms that keep politicians in check. You're not re-elected, okay? Those work in the separate market, but if we kind of mix the two markets, then it's a danger, because I think the mechanisms of selection don't work as well.
So I was also reading your work, some of it talking about how the divergence of views between average Americans and economists. And I was intrigued by one of the quotes that you mentioned that, and this is just an example, that ordinary Americans are skeptical of carbon taxes, not because they do not understand the economics underneath it, but because they do not trust all the assumptions underlying the economic reasoning.
Yeah, absolutely. This is, I think, is a wonderful example, because as economists we say, the most efficient thing in our world is to have carbon taxes, and we always analyze this under the revenue neutrality assumption, which means that if we are taxing some people, we are then redistributing back those taxes to them under a different form, so that they are not affected in their wealth, but they're only affected of their incentives on the margin. And so any economist worth his name tend to love the carbon tax. You ask ordinary human people, they hate the carbon tax. And they prefer other methods like regulation, for example. And the question is why. And so what we did in that survey, we actually asked people why they don't like the carbon tax. And it's not because they don't understand our reasoning. It's because they know that they're not going to have revenue neutrality. They know that the moment you tax CO2, those revenues will be taken by the government and used for something else. So that's number one. Number two, they know that this is incredibly unequal in terms of burden, so that if you tax CO2, you end up penalizing a lot people who drive cars, and they tend to implicitly subsidize people like me that take planes. I use very little cars. Why? Because I live close to university, so I don't commute every day. But I take a lot of planes. I'm here in India, and that burn a lot of CO2 to come here. Now, what I discover is kerosene for airplanes is tax-free. Why? There is a convention, blah, blah, but nobody talks about this. So when I fly here, I don't pay any carbon tax or any tax to any authority for all the CO2 I produce. But if I commute from the suburbs of Chicago to downtown Chicago, I pay taxes. And if I commute from the suburb of Paris to the downtown Paris, I pay a lot of taxes. So I discovered this during the Yellow Vest revolt.
Gilets jaunes, yeah.
Yeah, the Gilets jaunes, the Yellow Vest. They were absolutely right, because Macron was taxing them, but was leaving the upper class that was flying on the plane tax-free. So that was incredibly unfair from a redistributional point of view.
So even in London, I think they implemented these slow traffic regulations that if you are within the city center, you have to be below a certain limit, speed limit. So I guess this is again taxing poor people who probably don't live close enough. They have to drive from far away. So I guess it again taxes in another way.
Yeah, but it is creating a massive distribution, because if I am rich enough to live downtown London, I don't have to pay the tax. But if I live outside, I do have to pay the tax. And so that's the reason why there is so much tension.
But then how do we find a solution for this? Because I guess in the age of social media, the politicians need to look like they are doing something about the problem.
So I think that what we need to understand is that there is a reason why carbon taxes are unpopular. And if we really want to solve the CO2 problem, go in a different direction. So maybe regulation on standards might be a better way to do it. I actually came to the conclusion that there is a reason why, for example, now the oil producers are in favor or start to be in favor of a carbon tax, because they know will never be implemented. So they only support solutions that they know cannot be implemented. So we need to go to alternative solutions.
Your book with Raghuram Rajan, where you provide the defense for free markets. So it's a very classic textbook example to think about capitalism and how to defend it. And I find one of the parts over there where you talk about that markets always create losers. Mm-hmm. So maybe you can first explain why it's necessary to create losers.
So first of all, I'm not so sure that being a classic is good, because it means that you're so old that your stuff becomes a classic. But this said, I think that I have to say that book has a lot of insights that are not being fully appreciated and digested. So insight number one is, if you really want to have a well-functioning market economy, you need to have a very good safety net. And you might want to have it for ideological reasons, but in that book we say you have to have it for political economy reasons, because when things don't work, when you have a lot of discontent because the losers in the market system are too many, that's the moment where you have the highest risk of an alliance. Using a US metaphor, we have this alliance between the bootleggers and the Baptists, because during the Prohibition era, there was this alliance between the Baptists, who didn't want alcohol to be sold, and the bootlegger, who wanted the restrictions because that's the way they were making money. And so I think that there is this alliance between the capitalist who wants restriction to the system to make more money, and the people who are disenfranchised, to create this unholy alliance to stop the market system. So if you want the market system to work, you have to have a way to protect people on a regular basis. And so I think a beautiful example is in Europe, where you had more of a safety net. When COVID arrived, you didn't need to have those crazy transfers we had in the United States. Why? Because you have no more safety net. In the United States, where the safety net is so poor, we invented a bunch of subsidies that were source of an enormous amount of distortions, and we subsidize a lot of rich people for no reason. Okay, so I think that really having a good safety net is the best mechanism to have a resilient capitalist system in the long term.
So, I mean, I'm digressing, but I've talked to people who are in India, not even living in the US, and they got transfers.
Absolutely. That's how screwed up the system is in the United States. Absolutely.
But I think if you can also provide the defense for, because a lot of people think that free markets means that there would be no annihilation of companies, no losses of jobs. But I guess that's the premise of it, that if you have free markets, there would be, like, it's built into the system, some destruction.
No, I think one of the messages of the book is the capitalist system requires firms to fail, but not people to suffer. In the sense, if your firm is inefficient, most of the time, the responsibility, I would say all the time, the responsibility is of the people running the firm, not of the workers working for the firm, okay? And so if you have a safety net that absorb the cost for the workers of failure of firms, not only you're doing something good for society because the workers are insured, but you're doing something good for capitalists. Why? Because you can let the firms fail without using the workers as human shield. You know, I learned this the old-fashioned way in Italy. When I grew up, there was a company, I still remember, it was called Salvarani, that was producing cabinets for kitchens, okay? And the company was about to fail, and the entrepreneur decided to hire more people. And everybody was saying, what are you doing? You're failing. Why you hire people? Oh, because if I can pass the limit of 1,000 employees, I will never be let fail. Because how can you put 1,000 employees down the street? Now, if you have 100 employees, you can fail, but above 1,000, you're safe. Okay? That was called the Salvarani law, because if you're big enough, you're not allowed to fail. That's not the capitalist system. That's crony capitalism. So you need to have a good system that absorbs the unemployed in order to let the inefficient firms fail, so the new efficient firms can grow. In Italy, we saved so many inefficient firms that the firms have not grown for the last 25 years. You know, Italy did not have a growth in GDP per capita in the last 25 years. That's a disaster, okay?
And we have some of these dwarfs even in India. But I'll shift the focus to finance and this too big to fail idea. Mm-hmm. I guess you wrote extensively about the Silicon Valley Bank and how it was kind of protected in the end. So maybe you can talk a little bit from that side, that why this problem is even more worse when you're thinking from the finance side.
So I learned this story that is fantastic. When Silicon Valley Bank was about to fail, lawyers were overwhelmed with requests from venture capital firms and startup firms that whether their money was safe or not. Why? Because at Silicon Valley Bank, a lot of startups had some accounts where they were keeping in the checking account a certain amount of money. But when that money was passing a certain threshold, that money was moved into a money market account. However, they didn't know whether this was a separate money market account, and so that money was guaranteed by the assets on the other side, or that was a synthetic money market account, something that was paying like a money market account, but was an integral part of Silicon Valley Bank. And of course, that made all the difference in the world, because if you had all the money in a money market account, or most of the money, the losses you're going to face if Silicon Valley Bank goes belly up and deposit not insured would have been minimal. But if, on the other hand, all your money was in something that was at risk, then you would have major losses.
So just to understand, was any of this covered with the FDIC, the deposit insurance? No, it's separate than that.
No, these were uninsured deposits. So above 200,000, your deposit uninsured. So all these are uninsured deposit. But even the uninsured deposit, if you move that deposit into a money market account, you are 100% guaranteed by the asset on the other hand, and so you're not part of the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank. But if that's a synthetic money market account, this is an uninsured deposit of Silicon Valley Bank that will be impaired if Silicon Valley Bank goes belly up. Now, what I did not know is that most of these firms did not know which was which, because, this is a detail 99.9% of the time is irrelevant. And so they started to investigate that just the weekend before the collapse. Now, they found out later that probably 95 of that percent of that money was actually in money market accounts, so it was safe. But during that weekend, they did not know. So that's the reason why they threatened that a lot of people will be on payroll. A lot of payroll will not have been paid the next week because they thought that all the startup money was in Silicon Valley Bank and they would have failed. In fact, it was funny because during that weekend, I was skiing with my son and I was all talking about Silicon Valley Bank. And by the end of the weekend, I realized that he was working for a startup whose money was in Silicon Valley Bank. So he might not have been paid the next week. He was completely relaxed. I don't know how, but I was agitated for him.
He was insured by you.
Yeah, probably that was the reason. But as a result, the venture capitalists started to create a huge amount of pressure in Washington, threatening that all the startup firms will fire all the employees, including probably my son, if all the deposits were not insured. But they were wrong. They had plenty of money. But with this threat, they made sure that all the deposits were insured, costing in the federal deposit insurance system, and so indirectly U.S. consumers, $12 billion. Okay? So why we have to pay $12 billion for that? $12 billion is a huge amount of money. Okay? And I think that is creating the wrong incentives for the entire banking system.
So if you have to step back and there was not this specific detail, if there was still going to be some loss for these firms, how would you handle it in an optimal capitalism system?
I think that was good that the FDIC took over, but I would have imposed some losses on the uninsured deposit, because otherwise, why they're called uninsured? So uninsured deposits don't pay a premium to be insured, and then they get insured anyway. It's a bit like I don't insure my house against flooding, but when a flood comes, I'm paid anyway. So am I an idiot because I pay flood insurance? I create the wrong incentive.
So you need some skin in the game.
Absolutely. Or we recognize that all deposits are insured anyway, and then we need to change the banking system because it's a different game.
So I'll ask one last question on the regulation of I'm again going back to the firm side story. On the regulation of big tech, and you have one of these recent working papers where you talk about that, probably the optimal way to regulate these firms, given the size they have, is on an international scale and not at a national scale. Why do you think so is the optimal way?
For two reasons. Number one, there is strategic competition. So when Facebook, now Meta, when Zuckerberg testified in Congress several years ago, one smart journalist took a picture of his notes that he had in front of him, and one of the notes said, remind them of the Chinese. Okay, so every time the US regulators trying to threaten to do something about big tech, they say, oh, but the Chinese are a threat, so you need to let me do whatever because the Chinese. So I think that game is really very problematic. And two, because in the places where the big tech has developed, particularly the United States, those big techs are so politically powerful that they own the government. And this is, we thought that when we had a democratic president, democratic senate, democratic house, we will have some form of regulation of big tech. There was a lot of discussion, and after 2 years, the result was zippo. Okay, so I think that the big tech is too powerful in the United States. We're not going to have regulation in the United States. So the only way is to have regulation at the international level. And this is where I think there is a huge opportunity for Europe and India. Because Europe and India are together the biggest market for this stuff without a big local producer. And so they can create a consumer cooperative that say, if you want to operate in the Euro-Indian continent or market, you need to follow the following procedure. And if you do that, Facebook will be forced to do that, Google will go along, and also the Chinese will be forced to do, because if I'm Alibaba and I want to expand in India and Europe, I need to play by the Indo-European rules, okay? And I think that that's to me, the biggest opportunity is in that.
But this doesn't seem like international regulation. It's still local Indian or European regulation.
I think it's Indo-European regulation, but will naturally lead to an international agreement, because the moment this Indo-European coalition is formed, then at the international level, both China and the United States will start screaming, okay? And so you're going to sit down at the table. You're going to sit down at the table with a complete different bargaining power, because at the moment what you have is the US going around every European partner and picking them up individually. So they go to the Netherlands and said, oh, if you don't do that, we're not going to allow the international thing, or we're not going to give you this thing. So they play this game in which they win. Okay? If you have an Indo-European coalition strong enough, the US will not be able to play the game. The big tech in the United States will not be able to. And this will not only be beneficial to Europe and India, it will be beneficial to the US consumers. Because today the US consumers are owned by big tech.
Again, history question. So if you go back 100 years ago, wasn't it the same with some of the other big monopolies at that point of time? I guess people must be talking in similar fashion, that it's too difficult to break Standard Oil. They have paid off all the legislators, and probably you didn't need intervention from the outside.
No, yeah, but there is a big, big difference between the antitrust period of the early 20th century and today. What motivated the antitrust period in the early 20th century is that monopolies were charging too high a price. So the reason why you had, for example, the regulation of the railways is because the railways were exploiting their high prices. Today, the secret of big tech is that upfront they charge you nothing. Of course, they get back to you in two ways. Number one, they get your data. Number two, they charge more the advertisers that then charge the consumers. And so you end up paying directly. But at the front end, everybody loves Google. I'm the first one. I don't know how to go around a town without Google Maps, okay? And so I depend on Google Maps massively, and Google Maps is a major source of resources for me. So I love that aspect of Google. So I'm not against technology, I'm not against Google. However, I would like that to not entrench Google in a monopoly that because they have this information, then they become the only game in town for everything else.
Yeah, I hate them for 40 seconds of ads on YouTube these days. It was a pleasure talking to you, Luigi. Thank you so much for your time.
The pleasure was mine.